First of all, I went to see a performance of, an updated performance of Cathy Come Home last night, Forum Theatre down at the old fire station. And there's a point during that performance where the new Cathy has to get sent up to Newcastle. Her allocated house after being given emergency, then temporary housing in Luton, was Newcastle. It's the point, it's the kind of emotional crux of that show as she breaks down and doesn't accept the house. But in that meeting, she's completely alone, and she gets presented with this option. She gets told about how amazing this two-bed flat is, and then finally she finds out it's actually Newcastle, and she's got no idea, she's got no friends there, no connection. And after the performance, I talked to someone that was sat next to me who's from Shelter, works locally within the housing office. And she said the marked thing that's different here is that within Oxford that would never happen, because when it comes to homelessness services, Oxford City goes above and beyond. They go beyond their statutory duty in delivering. And so people have access to very careful support at that stage because the people are there in the room next to them. It's almost forced upon you to get advice, which other authorities don't have. And so I wanted to start this conversation by asking what we could do and what kind of further from what Francis is saying to go above and beyond in the provision of housing before people get to that stage within Oxford. And it might be a good place to start with Stephen, if you want to kind of comment on what we can do to work better with authorities, with housing associations, what opportunities from some of the models you've heard earlier today within CLTs and co-housing that are there.
Okay. Can everyone hear all right? I've got the opposite problem to Francis. I've gone down an octave in my voice in the last few days. Just thinking about the individual case of Cathy, and one of the characteristics of the housing market is that we need a housing policy for every individual person in the room. Everybody's their own kind of set of housing problems, and it's very difficult to find ways of kind of aggregating that up and for people to derive strength from each other. So, kind of a very similar case would be the situation in East London, Focus E15, the E15 mums. And they were a group of young women who were in a hostel for young women with children. So they at least had each other to kind of rely on. And they've waged a very effective campaign, I have to say, against Newham Council, who were determined to send them to cities all over the UK. And they said, no, we belong here, we're going to stay here. And they had each other to rely on. But one of the difficulties for them is that they're kind of a protest group. And many of the kind of housing solutions that are open through community land trusts and co-housing and all those other things, they take time. So it's very difficult to kind of find ways of joining up people who are kind of in extreme conditions and some of the solutions that are already available. I'm chair of the co-housing network, and I'm on the board of the CLT network, and we're very conscious that we're a solution for people who've got the time to work through a solution. I think we need to think about how we find different ways of working. Within London at the moment, there's a new initiative which involves those two networks and CDS cooperatives, who are an old-fashioned kind of secondary organisation that provides services to a lot of small frontline co-ops. And we've made a proposition to the GLA and the new mayor to set up a community housing hub. And that would be a kind of an open-door resource, both for communities that are already devising schemes of their own, but equally to try and connect some of the big strategic opportunities in London that the GLA are behind, things like Old Oak Common, and maybe even some of the later neighbourhoods on the Olympic Park, but other kind of big strategic opportunities, to see whether there are opportunities for community organisations to play a part in those developments. It's been a bit of a sea change, not just with the change of mayor, but also, I think, at the end of Boris's administration, was that conditions are so bad in London, we're just simply not producing anything like that, not even half enough, that the kind of people in power can no longer afford to be sniffy about who they deal with. So if a community can come along and do a scheme for 10 homes, it's another 10 homes that wouldn't otherwise happen. And that's been a bit of a transformation. And I think that they've also seen enough now of some quite high-profile community schemes, one in Brixton and one in East London, which have galvanised communities around those places, not only to feel very positively about the developments and to be actively involved in the planning of them and ultimately the ownership of them, but to actually come back and say, you're simply not putting enough homes on these sites. And for a developer or for a public authority to be faced with the community saying, put more homes on this land, it's usually completely the opposite reaction. People are saying too many homes, too big, too tall, too dense. So it's creating a kind of a pipeline now of what we call good news stories about development, which enables people to feel more connected with the very radical changes that are going on in some of our cities. It's hard work, and it's taken a long time to get here. But I think this is a bit of a kind of transformatory moment. So not only in London, but in at least another 10 cities, there are urban CLTs actively working on a programme that's been funded by the Oak Foundation, 20 schemes in all. And I think from that, we're hoping that there will be enough city councils who will get the idea that working with their communities in this way is a very positive new force for generating support for new housing in cities. These are things that communities can do on their own sometimes. Often it needs to be done, sort of thing that Francis was talking about. In East Cambridgeshire, there's a district council trying to meet some of the growth targets in the Cambridge sub-region, very large numbers of new homes required. Village communities very close to the cities, both Cambridge and Ely, feeling under threat, with lots of people coming in from outside and either displacing people who need to live and work in their community. Now, that council promoting community land trusts as the primary means of delivering new housing supply in those villages, with the supply very clearly focused on people who need to be in those villages, not just people who can't afford to live in Cambridge. So I think that there's a kind of a bit of a sea change. We've got cities like Bristol, Leeds, and Cambridge generally, now beginning to work very proactively with both individuals through the custom build process, but also groups, co-housing groups and CLTs, and even a cooperative. So it just feels like a very exciting moment when lots of things that haven't seemed possible for quite a while now seem to be really coming to the surface.
Great. We've got one person in the audience that I know needs to go and wants to make a direct comment on this sort of thing. Peter Thompson, who's the chair of the Civic Society, and we'll come back to the other people on the stage, but I don't know if you want to respond to that in terms of the opportunities you see as a civic society with quite a large membership in the city engaging with authorities and groups like this.
Well, we've got a membership of about... We've got a membership of about 950 people. I guess like most citizens' societies, the vast majority of those are fairly inactive, but they take an interest, I think, in what we do, or they wouldn't maintain their membership. We're interested in everything that affects the well-being of anybody that has anything to do with Oxford, and of course that involves housing. Because we're completely voluntary, we can only actually take positive steps in those areas that we have a sufficient core of membership that is prepared to become actively involved. I have to say, I think on the housing issue, the problems are so complicated, and I think we've had an indication of that today. They're so complex and wide-ranging that it's not an area that we've thought we could dabble in, and it's extremely interesting coming to hear what we've heard today. So if I could, as I said, I apologize, I've got to dash off to something else, but a number of issues I think arise that perhaps will stimulate further discussion. First of all, we've talked about affordability a lot today, but of course, buying and selling houses is in a market, and the reason the house prices are as high as they are is because there are significant numbers, sufficient numbers, to actually pay those prices. So to that extent, part of the problem is inequality, the inequality in wealth and income that exists. And I know Danny Dorling is speaking tomorrow. I think one of his very recent books is actually on the issue of inequality. And I think there's no short-term solution, but in the longer term, solving the housing problem is going to involve dealing with inequality in some way. The other thing I wanted to say is I think there's a complete anomaly in that we talk about housing on the one hand as, in fact, I think the sort of essence of what's been talked about today is housing as a habitat in which the human species lives, works, enjoys its lives. On the other hand, we've allowed it to become a commodity, an investment commodity that competes with stocks and shares or other issues. And that seems to me to be entirely wrong, and there ought to be mechanisms in place to at least not give an unfair advantage to people that simply regard housing, residential housing, as an investment opportunity. Having said that, the balance between ownership and rental, and as Francis has said, rental tenure is pretty important in this city. Nobody's actually said anything about the terms of tenancies, and it seems to me that an assured short-hold tenancy with a security of tenure of perhaps 6 months is no basis on which families can grow up, children can go to school with the confidence that next term they're still going to be going to the same school. So I think part of solving the problem of the housing situation is not ensuring that every single person owns their own house, but it's addressing across the spectrum other issues, including things like security of tenure.
Could we take some, because we've got quite a few issues already there. Could we start to chew on some of them through further conversation with the panelists? But thank you very much for the contribution. This one of Peter's first points was around it's a complex issue. That's one of the things that your talk was marked by in terms of starting to battle this idea that the issues are, the boundaries are, you can't jump over them. They're things that we can do. I was wondering, Alastair, if you wanted to talk about that, but also referencing what Francis said around knowing what land's available, and that there are things that we can do in order to work more effectively through tools that you've got maybe. Do you want me to? You can do, yeah, it's a bit loud.
Okay, I'll try and keep my distance from it. Yeah, I mean, the complexity thing is always the thing, is that, like, we should be used by now. We're going to accept that the big problems that we still have are complex, otherwise they wouldn't still be around. Like, we're at that point now in the world where if we allow ourselves to be defeated by complex problems, we're screwed. And so the part of it is developing almost just a set of tactics or a way of not being dwarfed by complexity, not being intimidated, not oversimplifying it, but equally recognizing, looking for the point of intervention where you can do something, and it's not going to solve the whole thing, but hopefully gets the wheel turning back in the right direction. And I think that goes to the thing Stephen was saying about, I think we are at a kind of sea change moment, and I'd like to think it's because people are really getting optimistic about new and seeing the value of new solutions. It might just be because the old models are breaking badly enough in a lot of areas. And I think one of the big sea changes that we're going to see is basically a recognition more and more that the 2000s model of speculative development with a tax off the side for Section 106, that idea that we can kind of tax back affordability back off that model, and that's all we need, is breaking. Like, people are realizing that's not the way that we can do affordability anymore. Like, there's got to be another show in town. Now, the difficulty then is saying, well, when you get to start looking at the community and the citizen sector, this problem of, well, it doesn't seem to be those at the really hard end of the problem. And faced with this complexity, the inclination, of course, at moments of austerity is go for the people in the hardest position. Well, one thing is that, well, that's not necessarily the right thing to do. Like, we need to be providing those services. But actually, if we can engage at the intermediates level and lift some of that weight off, like those at the very bottom, that's actually a good strategy too. So there's this thing of saying, well, what is it that the citizen sector can bring? If treating citizens as something other than people to just be consulted with while we do housing to you, but actually seeing them. They're bringing kinds of capital with them. And those are, in aging people, it's financial capital that's sitting under their feet, and they're sitting there looking at a care crisis. They will bring that capital to the table. Middle-class people will bring that agency, that effort capital with them as well. But the question is, okay, if we allow you to give you the opportunity to use that capital to turn that into housing through community organisations, through custom-build or self-build models, trying to get them to take as many other people with them as possible, I think is really important. But then also trying to kind of, use their effort to kind of alleviate the models at the bottom. So I think actually we're kind of going to go, I can see another thing emerging, which is more and more, for those really at the homeless end, as you were touching on, I think, we're going to, John Turner said that fantastic thing about housing is not a noun, housing is a verb. And I can more and more see increasingly that housing will be seen as a service in the sense that you'll be ultimately it's providing service to a human. So it's less thinking about the object and the roof, but actually thinking about the whole service around the person. And I think what's kind of interesting will be to see, I think housing associations already have to deal with that because more and more they're having to deal with things like energy bills and stuff, as well as the house itself. Like if everybody in a neighbourhood loses their jobs at once, then they have a rent problem. So suddenly it becomes in their interest to see the holistic picture of a neighbourhood, of saying, well, actually, what does education in this neighbourhood look like? What does housing in this neighbourhood look like? So I think at that point you can start to find ways back into complexity, which is just start somewhere and share. But on those things, in order to do that, we need to make what we are doing replicable and shareable. And that's really, really important, like that we find ways of making these models easier for the next person to do. And that is a big one. And it's built on a couple of things. It's built on just the kind of tactics for saying, I don't need to get this right, but I need to get it documented in a way that somebody else can then take it and use it. And again, we can use digital technologies to try and do that. So how do we document these sorts of business models or development models that community companies are using? But the other thing is, going back to infrastructure, we need to have the basic infrastructures in place that allow people to support this. And one of those is, for example, land registries and things like that. So actually trying to do what we can, I mean, you were talking about various initiatives to try and get more open transparency about what land is available where, because frankly, everyone else at the moment is scratching around. Thank God that the proposition to privatise the land registries was dropped, because that was the most amazing piece of economic illiteracy you've ever heard of. But we need to be really, even though times are hard, we need to be really looking hard at these sorts of reforming the basic tools that we all use to share things like data and things like that. So that was a very pitch-watch answer.
You got there. And Francis mentioned a few things around empty homes. And in Leeds, Manchester, there's Hull, there's various programs over the last few years that have really championed eco-retrofit within homes.
Yeah.
Up north, and not so much happened down south in comparison. And there's a few.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, within a city like Oxford, what's the opportunity for taking our housing stock and doing something along those lines?
I think, it is possible to retrofit pretty much any house you come across. Again, it's the level of complexity involved and the compromises that you might have to make. So in Oxford, you would probably have to make slightly different compromises and decisions than you might do in Liverpool. So in Liverpool, we're on the west coast, you think a lot about the climate and it being hit by storms off the Irish Sea a lot of the time, and that affects how you detail something. In Oxford, I was just talking before to someone who mentioned that the 3-bedroom houses here are generally a bit smaller. The old terrace stock is smaller than you would get in Manchester or Liverpool. So that means you might have to adapt your strategy slightly, but I'm pretty much convinced that it is possible to apply the principles of retrofit to anywhere. And the advantage that you have here as well, in comparison with Liverpool, Manchester, is that you have the property values that would sustain it. So if someone's going to spend £40,000 on a house in Eccles that's actually only worth 150, that in the current way things are set up, that might make them pause for thought. if you're actually spending £40,000 because you're doing exactly the same stuff, the same materials, the same labour, on a house that's worth 2 or 3 times that, it starts to look like a more sensible financial proposition in a way. So there are things down here that are probably harder, but there are definitely things that also help.
Okay. At this stage, I want to throw it out to the audience, whether or not there's any ideas, not necessarily questions, but kind of as quick as possible, maybe keeping it to one point, and wait for the microphone. But things that are practical, things that could happen. And we've probably got about 10 minutes or so now, but we can stay and keep doing this for a little longer. Okay, so the first one, Eleanor.
Just a quick thing that's already happened in Birmingham and in London, and which we're starting to try and do in Bristol, is to get a register available to people of microsites, because we've talked a lot about big spaces, but particularly for a community organisation, to get yourself into a position to be able to develop a site which would accommodate maybe 4 units, it would be relatively easy in terms of scale, and to set up such that you could do several of those sites in sequence. So that's something that maybe you could look at in Oxford, to get the register of all the microsites which are in themselves too small for the council, it to be economical for the council to dispose of individually, but to agree 4 or 5 sites to go to an organisation to work on is a great way to start using those little spaces.
Great, microsites. Over here. Oh, sorry, too far away. I'll stick over this side now for a little bit.
Thank you. I've only just arrived, so you may have covered this. But my question is, how can we tackle the dominance of the developers in driving up house prices?
That was a question, so I don't know if anyone wants... If we maybe take one more point, and then of developers in the house building sector. So one more, somewhere over... Yes, okay, sorry.
I'd really like a session explaining exactly what the powers of councils are and are not. Because I hear a lot of, oh no, the Mayor of Bristol can't do anything because councils can't do anything, or councils can do loads of things, they can do all these things. And I'd like to really understand in detail exactly what we as citizens can demand of our local authorities to do.
Great, okay, so what can councils do? Who on the audience wants to take on, first of all, the dominance of the developers, the house builders? Jump at once. Okay. Stephen.
Well, not a small question. And it's actually a very difficult one to answer. And it's not just about the dominance of developers. I think one of the things that we've experienced in this country is the kind of consolidation of development into a very small number of companies. And that's partly a function of the planning system becoming increasingly complex, and the need for people to be very well resourced to actually manage that process. So it actually costs a lot to get through planning. So it's very difficult for small developers to compete. Obviously, access to land markets and the way in which local authorities devise their strategies or their land disposal strategies all have a role. It's often easier for local authorities. They feel more comfortable in dealing with bigger developers because they've got established track record. Smaller developers, particularly post the financial crash, have found it much, much more difficult to access bank finance. But even the big developers are driven in a way by these kind of bigger financial issues. So, a developer will not get a bank loan to do a development unless they can show they're going to make a 20% margin. So that gets built into the whole process of testing viability in planning for whether you can afford to provide affordable housing or not. A kind of whole series of kind of factors which build up to the way in which their role, they become more and more a monopoly provider, and that's very, very different from any other country in mainland Europe. There simply isn't that kind of same kind of dominance. There's a much greater proliferation of smaller developers, many more community citizen kind of groups, with the financial institutions willing to lend to them. So particularly in the Netherlands and in Denmark and Germany that I know of, the banking system is geared up to provide development finance loans, retail mortgages in a way that makes much more competition. And I think one of the other big reasons why the big developers have come to the fore is that this is a kind of something when I die and somebody opens me up, they'll find something called DOE Circular 676 engraved on my heart, because almost exactly this month, 40 years ago, in the aftermath of the IMF crisis, the government at the time decided that they would withdraw from funding council housing and infrastructure. And bright young men were dispatched from the Treasury to local authorities where I worked at the time to say, party's over, we're not paying for this anymore. Now you could say at that time, you knew the writing was on the wall, because the one thing that government had managed to do in the post-war reconstruction period was to put money into infrastructure, which opened up land for development. When I was at college, the one thing you learnt was development follows infrastructure. We now have a system where infrastructure follows development if you're lucky. It's paid for out of development. So what happened over the intervening years up until the financial crash was that more and more burdens were being put on the development industry to provide its own infrastructure, which again made it more and more likely that only the very biggest players could play. And the government still hasn't learned that lesson.
I would just, a few years ago, I was interviewing Stephen for a bit of research I did, and he said something very, very wise, which sort of stuck in my head and has resonated a long time afterwards, which is, don't bash the developers over the head for doing something that they're not, for not doing something that they're not designed to do. Mm-hmm. Just go and find someone who is. And I think that's one of the big things, is because they've been in the only show in town so far, for so long, people have forgotten that there's a kind of process of intellectual capture. Mm-hmm. So we don't necessarily need to do that many actions to get rid of it's not about the dominance of the developers. It's actually breaking our dependence on developers, because there's loads of stuff that loads of people can do. Is if you just force yourself to break the assumption that they're the only show in town and just look around, I bet you there's somebody who is viable, who can do something, whether it's on micro sites or on large sites or whatever, whether it's a community organisation or self-build. I bet you there's something that does stack up. And what depresses me is how many local authorities are still desperately struggling and scratching around, trying to entice developers to come back and do something that they don't want to do and they're never going to do. And saying, look, there are other shows, increasingly there are other shows in town. And that, I know it seems like an obvious point, but I think every ounce of effort we spend fighting the developers is an ounce of effort wasted, because they're just going to keep doing what they want to do, and that's fine. But we don't need to be dependent on them.
Any reactions to that? Any further points? So, where's the microphone? Dan Schaff first, and then we'll come back over here to the side.
Down the plan. I want to emphasise something Francis said. There is a local plan in Oxford in process, and the planning system also has applications advertised. You can engage with the planning system every day, all day. Having said that, the cautionary tale, 5 years ago, I completely wasted my time going to the local plan inquiry to persuade the inspector that the Oxford City local plan or core strategy wasn't sound, because it had no policy on self-building, no policy on co-housing. The reason I know I wasted my time is that I didn't even feature in the inspector's report, because it has to be in the plan, and you have to object to it. You can't get anything inserted in the plan. So this time round, I'm very confident that there will be a policy on self-building in the draft local plan. There will be a policy on co-housing. So we have advanced, because I have every confidence in what I hear about the new culture in Oxford City. But what I would like to hear in this conference, being a planner, I'm listening attentively, what is wrong with the current planning system? What are they doing wrong now? And what could they do to help this agenda?
Over here on the other side, and we'll get some reflections. Maybe 5 minutes.
I think something that's a theme that's run through today and hasn't really been reflected overtly is around the political element to this. So much of what happens at a local level is political. So much of how the market is structured and how it operates is around the regulation and the policy related to that. in other parts of the European Union, in Spain in particular, and in Barcelona, housing activists are politically active and are part of the regional and city governments. In fact, the mayor of Barcelona is a housing activist. And I don't think that political action is the only way. I think practical action and cooperative action works hand in hand with that. But I think to create meaningful change, some sort of political action is required.
Hi there. Just coming back about the developers being the big bad guys, I'd agree on one level, but they are just taking advantage of the situation. And the situation is really because of a great void in skills, ability and damn guts in local authorities. And there's lots of reasons why that's happened. But I'd like to say that I think there are signs that that's turning. And so things like local councils setting up their own companies and actually building again will build that back. What I do hope, though, is that the people who are in those local authorities have actually got some guts and have got housing at their heart. Sadly, my experience to date is that that isn't the case, but I think over time that may turn round. It is a circular thing because it all goes round in the same way as most things go round in a circle. Hopefully we don't have to have a massive, massive, massive crisis before it changes, but sadly it might be.
Thank you. You can see that lots of these are being captured as you go, so maybe we'll take 2 more quick points if you can, and then we'll do a final reflection.
So it seems to me that different developers and housing associations and local authorities can play different roles. So housing associations can be very commercial. They can also build affordable housing. And actually, with what you just set out in terms of Oxford City Council's role, it sounds like in the future you want to build affordable housing, but also generate a surplus to then cross-subsidise other housing services. So I guess what I'd be really interested in is actually marking out different developers and actors in the sector and being clear about what they're doing to a particular bit of land, so that developers don't say that they're building affordable housing when we know that they're doing everything in their power to reduce that amount of affordable housing. That local authorities can act as a clear platform for community groups in some cases, but then in other cases they're not creating a sense of false hope when actually they just need to make some money to then cross-subsidise services. So just a bit more clarity around that, and I understand it might be politically difficult given central government's kind of relationship with local authorities. But I wouldn't want to kind of join a community group, identify a bit of land, work with a local authority, and then find that actually the local authority needs that land for another purpose.
I would just like to say something about the question around planning. And I guess as someone, I work as an artist and as a community facilitator within planning processes all the time and in different countries. And I think what it is at the moment, what I experience a lot is there's 3 points. Like one is sometimes a misunderstanding of where the expertise lies. So I would say people who live locally are the experts of their place, and they're often not being listened to as that. So planners consider themselves the expert. Of course, they have expertise in a very particular way, but it only works in collaboration with the local expertise, and that only works if you take that seriously, really seriously. The other thing, I think, is a lack of imagination. It's kind of looking at something and always looking for what the problem is and how you solve it, and not looking for what the opportunity is and what's already present. I think I said that before. What's there, what's here, who is already here, what's already here, and how can we work with that and develop that? Particularly people, but also infrastructure and space. How is space working already? Maybe it's already working in certain ways that you don't understand. And I think the last one is about taking risks, about jumping and going, okay, this is new, this is different, let's give it a try.
It sounds like there's more that can be done to support some of these local ideas, local groups, alongside local self-build registers. Maybe it's local skills registers, maybe it's local land maps, things that are starting to support communities come up with the things that we're talking around here. There'll be a lot more opportunity to talk about these things over the next 2 days, especially on Sunday. So if you want to continue having these conversations, if you want to put anything else up on the board, then please do. Please continue to take these back to where you're from, to start really engaging with these places and coming up with new ways of innovating and contributing not only to your local areas, but to the kind of national picture as well. As we've heard, there's lots of opportunity to do it, so please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.